Well, good evening, everybody. It's a delight to welcome everyone to this seminar, this workshop on religious peace building amidst political polarization. Thank you for your patience as we just wait for the attendees to populate the room for this event. It's a very large number of people who are joining us this evening, which is excellent. As people join, I can give my welcome. I'm Father Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute, which is based at Blackfriars Hall in the University of Oxford. Inspired by Bartolomé de las Casas, the 16th century Dominican friar who championed the rights of indigenous peoples of the New World, so-called. The Institute exists to promote research, hard thinking into difficult questions of social justice. But this event, of course, is being co-sponsored with a number of institutes. I'm delighted to say that it's being co-sponsored by the Peace Studies Department of the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, by the extensive Catholic Peacebuilding Network, and institutes at the University of Notre in South Bend, Indiana, the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, and the Keough School of Global Affairs. And I'm going to pass you over now to Gerard Powers, who is going to moderate the event this evening and will introduce the various speakers. But just one practical thing, or perhaps two practical things before I do so. The first is, of course, to invite you to join in the discussion as we move on. And the way to do that is to write comments or questions into the Q&A box. And you'll find a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen usually, which will say Q&A, and will take you through to where you can write your questions. So with that practicality, again, I welcome you very warmly and pass you over to Gerard Powers, who is Director of Catholic Peacebuilding Studies at the Kroc Institute. Gerard.
Thank you, Richard, for your kind introduction, and thank you for hosting this webinar and for inviting the Catholic Peacebuilding Network and Notre Dame's Kroc and Keough-Naughton Institutes to be part of it. Religious actors in the United States and Northern Ireland each face ongoing challenges of conflict and violence tied to political polarization. But that's true of many countries. So why a dialogue between Northern Ireland and the United States on religion and polarization? Perhaps because the two have been joined at the hip for many years. The US government and other US actors have played a significant role, both positive and negative, in Northern Ireland. I myself have been involved in endless numbers of ecumenical and interreligious initiatives over the past 3 decades, but none was more fruitful than serving between 1987 and 2002 with 2 of our guests, Reverend John Dunlop and John Carr, on the Interchurch Committee on Northern Ireland, which represented the Presbyterian and Roman Catholic churches in the United States and Northern Ireland. Another reason for Northern Ireland-US dialogue, as a professor at a university whose nickname is the Fighting Irish, we need not mention the impact on the United States of the millions of Americans whose roots lie in the island of Ireland, north and south. Clearly, the dynamics of religion and political polarization in Northern Ireland and the United States are different. The differences between the 2 cases might well outweigh the similarities. That's part of our discussion. But we are convinced that the peacebuilding role of religious actors can be enhanced when we break out of our preoccupations with our own distinct situations and take the time to learn from the challenges and opportunities for religious peacebuilding in conflicts elsewhere, however different they might be from ours. The format today is that we will first address the situation in Northern Ireland and then address the situation in the United States. Each of our guests will speak for 7 to 10 minutes, and we'll then have a half hour or so for discussion and questions. So let's start with Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is perhaps the most studied conflict in the world, and it boasts one of the most studied and celebrated peace agreements, the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. The role of religion is a much contested issue. For many, Northern Ireland is the poster child of sectarian religious conflict. For others, religion is, if anything, mostly a proxy for a political, economic, nationalist conflict over self-determination and other issues. Whatever one's take on the religious dimensions of the conflict, it's worth noting that Northern Ireland has had more faith-based peace and reconciliation initiatives per capita probably than anywhere in the world. And religious actors played a key role in the Good Friday Agreement and afterwards. Whatever one thinks of the role of religion in the political polarization in Northern Ireland, there's little doubt that much can be learned from both the positive and negative dimensions of that role. And we have two people who will help us understand the role of religion in Northern Ireland. Maria Power is a senior research fellow in human dignity at the Casas Institute for Social Justice at Oxford. She is the author of 2 excellent books on religion in Northern Ireland, From Ecumenism to Community Relations, Interchurch Relationships in Northern Ireland, and Catholic Social Teaching and Theology of Peace in Northern Ireland, Cardinal Cahill Daly in the Pursuit of the Peaceful Kingdom, which was published last year. In 2022, Palgrave will publish a collection of essays on violence and peace in sacred texts that she has edited with Reverend Haytner, and she is currently writing a theology of community development for Northern Ireland. The Reverend John Dunlop was the minister of Rosemary Presbyterian Church in North Belfast from 1978 to 2004. He has served in numerous leadership positions in the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, including moderator of the General Assembly, co-convener of the Church and Government Committee, and a member of the Irish Interchurch Committee. He's also been a leading figure in numerous other initiatives related to the conflict. In his book, A Precarious Belonging, Presbyterians and the Conflict in Northern Ireland is essential reading for anyone who wants to understand the religious dimensions of conflict and peace building in Northern Ireland. Why don't we turn to you, Maria?
Thank you. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. Oh, here it is. Sorry. This is why I don't usually use technology. Right. Okay. Well, thank you for coming, everyone. When Pope Francis was on BBC Radio 4's Thought for the Day last Friday, he taught us that every crisis calls for a vision, the ability to formulate plans and put them rapidly into action, to rethink the future of the world, our common home, and to reassess our common purpose. While Francis was talking about climate change and the upcoming COP26 meeting, his words provide us with the inspiration we seek to overcome political polarisation that is still prevalent in Northern Ireland some 23 years after the Good Friday Agreement was reached. And I took this photo just a couple of weeks ago to show that polarisation is still around. In brief, the Protestant Unionist Loyalist and the Catholic Nationalist Republican communities still vote by and large along sectarian lines. Resources such as housing and public amenities are still contested, although this is slowly abating, and the Northern Irish government is working incredibly hard to overcome this. Corruption is common amongst the political classes. New migrations to the region have resulted in racism, and paramilitarism is endemic within working class communities. As one of the participants in my current research project put it, it's just too much in our DNA for it to disappear in 20 years. Within working class communities in particular, polarisation is framed in terms of winners and losers of the conflict, with the Protestant Unionist loyalist community very much viewing itself as the loser, abandoned by a British state, especially through Brexit, that it had so valiantly fought for throughout the 20th century. However, there is an alternative narrative, a narrative of hope, as it were, one of faith-based organisations and churches working together and separately to present an alternative vision of politics and society in which we use the teachings of Christ, and if you're Catholic, the magisterium and Catholic social teaching, to create a picture of society as it should be and a map to get us there. So my remarks here this evening are going to cover three themes, and they kind of cover the methodology I work with as a theologian and ethicist. How we got to where we are, where we're going, and what the journey might look like. So it's obvious from my description of contemporary Northern Ireland that the world is not as it should be. It is not the way God wants it to be, and political, social, economic, and religious relationships in Northern Ireland are broken. As this slide created by Tear Fund so aptly demonstrates, broken relationships with ourselves, God, others, and wider creation creates the perfect storm of the personal and social conditions that leave a society open to political polarisation. In Northern Ireland, this has led to identity being formed primarily through the lens of the political, with identity politics and therefore political polarisation being intensified by high levels of socioeconomic deprivation and drug use and mental health issues, leading to people being preyed upon by paramilitary organisations. This leaves communities vulnerable, making it harder to move beyond the polarised silos that have always existed there. These groups need to overcome prejudice and see the other as truly human. As we know, attitudes are based upon perception until relationships exist. The churches are not innocent in this, and they often contribute to such patterns through their own siloed understanding of their role in society and the creation of what one evangelical minister I spoke to described to me as a turn or burn culture, which often holds people of faith back from challenging behaviours that are contrary to gospel teachings. But before we can decide or suggest how to change things, we must envision a society we must envision what a society free from political polarisation looks like. As Francis teaches, quote, to rethink the future of the world. As a pastor from a deeply divided rural area west of the Ban asked me, if we don't know what we're trying to achieve, how on earth can we get there? Here is a very brief outline of my vision, which is based upon the gospel, Catholic social teaching, and dialogue with religious and secular actors who are working to overcome political polarisation and build a peaceful society, or build shalom. The dignity of every human person in this society is recognised, meaning that politics is no longer viewed as a venue for competition, but as a means of service to society. We need to ask ourselves the following: what does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God? We need to go back to realising that everyone is made in the image and likeness of God. Political and social policy needs to be founded upon the principle of human flourishing. As a street pastor from a very divided town in County Down said to me, our focus needs to be on enabling people to achieve their God-given potential. We must do everything we can to ensure that. Relationships need to be based upon respect rather than tolerance. Tolerance is just a way of coexisting, while acceptance is a way of living communally. Finally, churches need to take a lead. Many have already done so, but there are some dissenters within the ranks, in building a more peaceful society. As one community development worker in East Belfast said to me, peace building and reaching out across divides should be an expression of the life of the church. So what will or should the journey look like? the first thing I'll say is that it needs to be completely localized and built upon the local community. The first thing we need to do is treat the causes as well as the symptoms of political polarisation. For example, in Northern Ireland, the social and economic deprivation that is leaving communities vulnerable to the identity politics creating political polarisation needs to be addressed at all levels of society through, for example, grassroots motivated community development work, Christian social action, as well as government policy. I know that the term co-design is becoming a bit kind of old hat within policy circles in Northern Ireland, but it really is a very good way of animating communities and helping them overcome polarisation. Everything needs to be adapted to the local social ecology. So one example I'd like to give is the work of the Resurgent Trust, which is actually a secular organisation in Lisbon, which has shown how a community can transform itself by working in partnership with the statutory bodies in Northern Ireland. As churches and faith-based organisations, we must also engage in self-reflection and discernment rather than assuming that we have all the answers. We must also understand our own broken relationships and seek to fix them through dialogue and relationship building. As Thrive Ireland teaches, we need to listen to God, listen to the community, and listen to each other to determine what we need to do. Diane Holt, the director of Thrive Ireland, suggests that, quote, "We need to listen with the intent of understanding so that fears can and will be dealt with. But this way of listening also allows people to find out things for themselves. We must always allow people agency." Prayer can also be a useful tool for challenging political polarisation, as it changes the person praying as well as the person being prayed for, and can shape people's knowledge and understanding of a situation. By, for example, people being asked to pray for particular events or groups doing work within the local community. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you'd like me to. Such a process of listening and understanding, however, can only occur when strong relationships exist. We need to take the time to build those relationships. Most of all, we need to remember that this is a long-term process. We ourselves are not going to see the end product, but we have to take part. So to come back to Pope Francis, political polarisation can be overcome if we take the time to rethink the future of our world and our place in that future. Not only can we provide a vision of that alternative possible future, but we also as churches and faith-based institutions have the resources to guide us on that journey. We need to do this both as individuals and collectively through our faith institutions, and then as a society. But one question I would argue, and I suppose I would argue this as a theologian and ethicist, must be at the heart of all of this and should animate any action that we take. What is God's vision for the world? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Turn it over to you, John. I think you're on mute.
Well, thank you, Maria, for that analysis. Let me say to everybody that I am not an academic. I am basically a working parish minister who, as Jerry says, spent some long number of years working in North Belfast. Let me go back 23 years ago to the United States of America and to an international symposium at the Joan B. Kroc Institute concerned with religious dimensions of violence, peace and security, where the two main speakers were John Paul Lederach and Mark Copeland. Now, Mark Gopan's a Jewish scholar, and he talks about oppositional identity, in the course of which he said, Judaism has many things to say about peace, violence, and conflict resolution. It just has never been documented in recent times, with a few exceptions, particularly because, on the whole, the post-Holocaust scholarly Jewish community has not been very much in the mood to mine the sources of Judaism for conflict resolution. On the contrary, he said, the prevailing focus of attention has been increasingly on those rituals and laws of Judaism that would buttress cultural and physical survival, which would be specifically aimed almost as weapons, rather than religious deeds against annihilation. This trend, he said, especially focuses on minutiae of practice that makes a clear boundary between who is in and who is out of the group, who can be trusted and who cannot be trusted, rituals that become in their modern incarnation markers of ethnic and national trust, markers of distinction, markers of insulation from a dangerous world. Now, that address which I heard those years ago rang bells in my head immediately, for it provided for me a way into understanding the challenges which faced and continue to face us in Northern Ireland, as Dr. Gopan spoke about oppositional identity. That is, community identity shaped and internalized by the real or perceived enemy and the existential, political, or violent threat to my continued existence or the well-being of my or of our community. In Northern Ireland, it has expressed itself as me as not you, and us as not them. I think it's the taproot of sectarianism and also of racism, because it defines identity negatively. It operates within Protestant unionism as we are not Catholics, and it operates within Catholic nationalism as we are not British. Now, following partition of Ireland 100 years ago, two parts of Ireland were created, each defined by exclusive and excluding political ideologies, that of Irish Catholic nationalism and Ulster Protestant unionism, neither of which honoured or protected their minorities. Protestantism and Catholicism were intertwined into those conflicting ideologies, shaped, of course, by centuries of violence, shaped by pre-Vatican II Ireland, and intensified by the violence of the last 50 or so years. I listened to a government minister once in England addressing the racial problems of England, in which he said, if you only have bonding and you don't have bridging, you will have conflict. Christian churches are bonded communities. There may be a degree of diversity within the bonded community, but strategies are devised to consolidate and strengthen the bonded community. Now, in a conflict and polarized situation, a bonded community will inadvertently put itself at risk if it does not build bridges with its neighbor, and that neighboring community will be different from them. Theologically, we talk about the Trinity as a bonded community of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The Incarnation and Pentecost are costly bridging exercises in the service of reconciliation, the horizons of which are the whole of the universe, as Paul wrote in the first chapter of Colossians. And it is in the service of Christ and of that vision and purpose that the church exists. Now, what way can religious actors function within that context and across these boundaries? Well, let me distinguish 5 interlocking aspects of church. At every level, peacemaking opportunities exist. First of all, the church is an ecumenical body, like the Irish Council of Churches, founded in 1923, now with 14 denominations, and the Irish Interchurch Meeting, which links the largest Protestant churches with the Catholic Church. One of the unexpected consequences of COVID has been Zoom. The leaders of the churches have been meeting often, more often than usual, and thereby they have got to know one another better than ever before. And recently, the leaders of the 4 biggest churches planned a difficult and challenging ecumenical service in Armagh Cathedral and the Anglican Cathedral just 12 days ago, on the 21st of October, to mark partition and 100 years of Northern Ireland. It was a service of memory and a service of hope. The President of Ireland was invited, but found that he could not attend. It was also boycotted by Sinn Féin. At the next level, there's the denominations. And the denominations can issue statements, devise training programs like Youth Link for Catholic and Protestant young people, or a single denominational program like Preparing Youth for Peace, issue denominational peace vocation statements which provide a vision. And the church can also at official level engage with politicians, encourage national reconciliation and dialogue. The church cannot do the hard graft of political negotiations, but I believe they can help to create the environment which will help to make this dialogue possible. And I think the churches did a fair degree of that with many other people before the Good Friday Agreement. However, sometimes people judge denominational efforts to have been inadequate. Then the next level is the church as it exists as a congregation or a parish in a local community, because the church at the end of the day walks on the ground in a local setting. As an organized body, it will care for its members. Pastoral care will be important where people have been murdered, for example, but the question is, does it go further and cross the boundaries of alienation? I worked in North Belfast for 26 years. I was fortunate that we had inter-church activities involving Catholics, Anglicans, Methodists and Presbyterian churches. We had worship services, alpha courses, hosted pre-election political hustings, and had many other initiatives, providing interaction across the boundaries. And then you've got the individual ministers or priests or members of churches who may to a greater or lesser degree freelance in taking initiatives, and they may or may not act with the support and in the name of the wider body as they act for peace, justice and reconciliation in deeply polarized society. Courageous individuals like Father Alec Reid, who is an intermediary between the IRA and John Hume, and the Reverend Roy McGee, who engaged with loyalist paramilitaries. Now, as well as all of that, you've then got individually ordained or non-ordained actors who operate in parachurch organizations. And we have heard from Maria about a couple of them. You could think of Corrymeela, established in 1965 by Ray Davey. It still flourishes, but I find that many Presbyterians never go there because they don't like any thought of ecumenism. And then you've got Econi, the Evangelical contribution in Northern Ireland, now called Contemporary Christianity. And they produced a book of studies some years ago called For God and His Glory Alone. And that studied mined the biblical themes of love, forgiveness, reconciliation, justice, righteousness, hope, etc., all contextualized in Northern Ireland. The leader of that group was David Porter, who is currently the Chief of Staff for the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Omagh bomb was a terrible atrocity which followed the Good Friday Agreement. On the Sunday or two after that, there was an open-air televised inter-church service, which was organised by the Omagh Churches Forum, which pre-existed before the bomb. So trust existed between the church leaders in Omagh prior to the bomb. So when the atrocity came, the structures were already there to help people. And then we have the Inter-Church Committee in Northern Ireland, which you have mentioned, Jerry, Catholic and Presbyterian churches in North America and Ireland, and John Carr and Jerry and I and others were involved in that. It brought Presbyterian ministers and Catholic priests to the United States to talk about the complexity and challenges of Northern Ireland. Rev tours, they were called. People who had a record of working together in Northern Ireland. And that group collectively, among other things, addressed the issue of fair employment, issued the call for fair employment and investment, which among other things detoxified the McBride principles and sought to solve the problem. It was highlighted by Cardinal Daly and myself at President Clinton's White House Conference on Investment in Washington in May '95. It involved engagement with trades unions, investment bodies, political parties and governments in the United States, Ireland and the UK. Now, all of this has been an enriching experience for me, but sadly, a great many people have not taken the opportunity to be involved in these initiatives. It has taken me out of claustrophobic, bigoted small places into the wide horizons inhabited by people who are different from me. It has taken me out of a bonded community into a bridge building exercise. In a polarized society, there is more than one story to be told, and political ideology is often focused narrowly on the telling of one part of the story. So it's important that we listen and that we learn, and that in the churches we teach people to listen and learn. because there is more than one story to be told. So let us hear who you, or as we say in Northern Ireland, usins, let us hear who usins are. And let me tell you about us, so that we might collectively have the experience of belonging, which goes beyond oppositional identity, where us and we can include one another.
Thank you very much, John. You people bring your kind of insider experience as a religious leader in Northern Ireland, and few people have been as strong as you have in helping the Presbyterian community, for example, understand the hopes and dreams and concerns of the Catholic community, and vice versa. So appreciate very much your remarks. Let us turn now to the situation in the United States. Political, class, racial, cultural, and geographical divisions have been increasing for many years in the United States. But recently, the connection between these divisions and violence has increased significantly. The role of religion in politics, economics, and culture in the United States is well-trod territory, but much less attention has been paid to the role of religion in the kind of political polarization that leads to violence and threats to democracy of the kind we experienced on January 6th of this year. To help us sort through these dynamics, we are fortunate to have with us John Carr, who is an adjunct professor of theology and founder and co-director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. The initiative sponsors some of the most must-watch and much-watched webinars on current topics related to Catholic social teaching and action. Before coming to Georgetown, John served for over 20 years as director of the Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development at the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He would be included on anyone's short list of the most influential Catholics in the United States on matters of Catholic engagement in politics and public policy. Liz Hume is acting president of the Alliance for Peacebuilding, a network of more than 120 organizations working in 153 countries. If you're interested in peacebuilding, the Alliance for Peacebuilding is the place to go. Prior to joining the Alliance, she served as head of the Election Commission Secretariats for the OSCE in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, worked for the International Rescue Committee in Pakistan and Afghanistan, helped establish the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation at the U.S. Agency for International Development, and managed major USAID peacebuilding and governance programs in Ethiopia and Senegal, among many other things. As a specialist in peacebuilding in fragile states, she was better positioned than many of us thought was necessary to write her recent policy paper, Building Sustainable Peace and Preventing Violence in the United States. Thank you both for joining us. And John, would you like to start us off?
Thank you, Jerry. I have mixed feelings about my role today. I'm honored by who has brought us together, who is on this panel, and the topic, which is so important. I am anxious. Excuse me, I'm not an expert like Liz, but as Jerry suggested, I bring some experience at the intersection of faith and public life, 2 decades working with Jerry at the U.S. Catholic Bishops Conference. One of the most enlightening and enriching experiences at the conference was my modest participation in the Interchurch Committee on Northern Ireland. My annual pilgrimage to Belfast and beyond taught me a lot about faith, justice, peace, and leadership. Having said that, I am woefully out of touch. I know as much about Brexit and borders as you know about the reconciliation and budget process in the US Congress. However, I'm appreciative of the opportunity to reconnect, to listen and learn. I'm not going to outline a program, but I want to share some thoughts on some lessons I learned in Northern Ireland, where I think we are now, some of the challenges and assets we have, and as time permits, some tasks and directions. as a contribution to the conversation to follow. Here are some lessons I learned from visiting Northern Ireland that I think are relevant today. The first is don't follow John Dunlop on a program. He is so thoughtful and his experience is so rich and he is so eloquent. More directly, you need to know what you don't know. You need to know that what you think you know may be wrong. You need to listen and learn and then listen some more. Complexity matters, history matters, loss matters, fear and hope both matter. As John suggested, everyone has their own story. Resist stereotypes, beware of glib analogies or rash judgment. Build bridges and trust, relationships and friendship matter. Women may not lead the major institutions, but they do most of the important work. And support those who tell the truth. Stand up to the wrongs on your own side. I think of Catholics who would not justify violence and Protestants who oppose discrimination. Having warned against overgeneralization and strained analogies, let me say a few words about the current context. In the US, political violence we could not imagine, an attack on the US Capitol to overturn an election. Examples of religious and ethnic violence. Among hundreds of mass shootings, a man walked into a church and killed people because they were Black. A man walked into a synagogue and killed people because they were Jewish. A man walked into a shopping mall in Texas and killed them because they were immigrants. The Attorney General says we have a domestic terror threat that is represented by racially or ethnically motivated extremists. As part of a long overdue racial reckoning, specifically the police killing of unarmed Black Americans, which led to major conflicts and protests, we have a call for reform over policing, police misconduct, specifically the ways police treat members of minority communities. And we have conflict over Confederate and other monuments and symbols, turning their removal into battles over history and identity. Now intense conflict over how our schools teach history on matters of racial injustice. Some of this might sound a little familiar to our friends from Northern Ireland. Maybe it's time for an interchurch committee from Northern Ireland to help us sort through some of these. More broadly, democracy itself is under threat. Many Americans won't accept election results. We're now battling over voting rights and who runs the elections. Extreme partisanship is the norm. It has paralyzed the Congress. Bipartisanship is rare and it's dangerous for those who practice it. We have increasing divisions based on identity, ethnicity, ideology, and yes, religion. Some of us demonize those that are different from us as not wrong, but evil, not misinformed, but dangerous. Religion can be, is, and should be a source of hope, help, and healing, but it can also be a part of the problem. I think there is a scary mix developing on connections between religion and identity, faith, and partisanship. Sometimes our behavior is more tribal than biblical, more a source of troops than sources of thought in public life. Religious groups can be seen as part of the base, not a source of wisdom and healing. For more secular people, politics can become a religion with its own orthodoxy, intolerant of heresy or dissent, offering a sense of belonging and identity, often defined, as John suggested, by who and what you are against, and bringing with it a sense of besiegement and persecution. In my own Catholic community, the polarization of political life is increasingly reflected in ecclesial life. And sadly, I fear that the leadership of the Catholic community has effectively been silent, absent, sometimes irrelevant with occasional statements and calls for prayer, but not enough leadership in our racial reckoning, in responding to violence, in threats to democracy, on issues of racism and policing, on voting rights and democratic institutions, and on COVID and the common good. We do the work of the church every day: prayer and worship, feeding the hungry, sheltering the homeless, educating the young, caring for the sick. But we need our leaders to help us recognize what is at stake, challenging our assumptions and our prejudices, and sometimes our partisanship. There are lots of counterexamples working at the local level, as Maria suggested, for racial justice and community building. But in my own Catholic community, in two main cases, our politics shapes our faith instead of the other way around. We're not where we want to be. And frankly, we are held back by reduced capacity. COVID, sex abuse costs has diminished the capacity of the church. The credibility of the church has been damaged by sex abuse. Our leadership has sometimes not been up to the challenge. We have a crippling clericalism that does not reflect the diversity of our church: women, Latinos, African Americans, and young people. And frequently we seem to be preoccupied by internal battles. Our leadership has been divided and diverted over the last year on the question of whether President Biden ought to be able to receive communion, rather than how we respond. How do we come out of COVID as a united community? But we can make a difference. We have assets. We have ideas in Catholic social teaching, which Maria mentioned. The most important word in overcoming polarization is "and." The most important word in Catholic social teaching is "and." Human life and dignity, human rights and responsibility, solidarity and subsidiarity. Our community has experience and presence. We are everywhere, serving those in need, calling people to worship. There are a lot of Catholics, and we're one of the last swing groups in American political life. Catholics divided 50-50 in the last election. We may be the only institution, or one of the few institutions, that is Black and Latino, Anglo and Asian, Native American and immigrants, rich and poor, Democrats, Republicans, independents, liberal, progressive, and in between. And we have leaders. I particularly think Pope Francis has been a leader that calls us to a higher vision, as Maria suggested. But we are not where we want to be. There are signs of hope. The leaders on this call, the members of the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, the work of Kroc and Oxford and other centers, Pax Christi, Pope Francis and his work with popular movements. I think of religious communities of women. I think of San Egidio and others. There are small efforts. Our little initiative at Georgetown is an example. There is a hunger for the moral vocabulary of Catholic social teaching. There is a hunger for civil dialogue. Since COVID hit, we have organized more than 35 online dialogues, one yesterday, and have reached more than 140,000 viewers, because people want to hear this message and they want an alternative to the polarized status quo. Better Angels is a group in our America that is doing this. Civilize It is a program in the Catholic community. There are congregations in every community working across religious lines. In conclusion, I think this is a time for renewal. New leaders, Latino leaders, women leaders, younger leaders, less invested in the old fights. This is a time for recommitment to Catholic social teaching, including the notion of the common good. This is a time to rebuild bridges. Peacemaking ought to begin in the church. And this is a time to reimagine our role in society as leaven, listening, learning, telling the truth. challenging unjust and destructive divisions. Let me close by suggesting some directions in the political arena and from the biblical story. The church in public life ought to be the church, not an interest group. We ought to listen and learn before we proclaim. We ought to be political, not partisan, not chaplain, not cheerleader for a faction, not an adversary, a predictable adversary. We need to be principled, not ideological, working across religious, ideological, partisan lines. We need to be civil, but not silent, not attacking the motives of others. We need to build bridges, not walls. We need to engage and persuade, not judge and condemn. And we need to be engaged, not used, to advance agendas of identity and partisanship. Well, my memories of our time in Northern Ireland, late at night, we would talk, and Catholics would talk about Catholic social teaching, and our Presbyterian friends would talk about the Bible. I want to break that stereotype and end with a passage from the Bible, St. Matthew's Gospel. We need a church right now that reflects the Beatitudes. We need a church that is poor in spirit, not attached to power or riches. We need a church that mourns at a time of so much loss, a church that offers humility and meekness, is not searching for power, a church that hungers and thirsts for justice, that is merciful, not judgmental, a church pure in heart, sharing the gospel of Jesus, not political or ideological agendas, a church of peacemakers who can really be called children of God. In the words of Jesus, we need believers who will strive to be salt of the earth and light of the world in a society that needs the seasoning of the gospel and the light of God's love at a time of division, fear, and loss. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that challenging and comprehensive overview from a Catholic perspective. We now finally have Liz Hume, who will give us a peace-building perspective based on her many years of working for peace around the world.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I just want to start off and say my interest, understanding of these issues go back into the 1980s when I went to college at Boston College, which is the Jesuit university. I learned about Northern Ireland there. I was a history international relations major studying the conflicts in Northern Ireland, understanding the US's role in Central America, and how nuns at that time and priests were being killed. So that's really where I got my start in this work and understanding what does this mean. But when people say that they're surprised or they can't believe that this is happening in the United States, when I came back from Ethiopia in 2012, I had been there for about 4 years to the US. I was incredibly concerned, extremely concerned. And I think maybe because I had been out of the country for a while, seeing the change in terms of the toxic polarization, the way people were dehumanizing each other was incredibly concerning to me. But let's stop and look where we are in the globe, in the world, and how we're fitting into this conflict dynamic. So we know the world is experiencing a 30-year high in violent conflict. We know it's deadly, it causes widespread destruction, and it remains the primary driver of violent extremism. It forces displacement that we are seeing at an all-time high that we haven't seen since World War II. We have 1 in 33 people globally, the highest figure in decades, needs protection, humanitarian aid. COVID-19 is stabilization in reverse and hitting countries like the United States extremely. it really had a significant impact here in the United States. We got lucky with the vaccine. But prior to that, we were not doing well at all. Climate change is compounding conflict and fragility, both here in the US and abroad. And we know technology is expanding dis and misinformation. We have a global violent conflict problem, and ending this should be one of the greatest challenges of our times. And I think what has become so traumatic for people or difficult is that places like the United States realize they are not exceptional. Even these so-called democracies, these stable democracies, are experiencing grievances, breakdown of resiliencies, resulting in increasing instability and violence. But we need to look at this as a complex system, just like we would anywhere else in the world. It is not one thing that is creating this problem. And our grievances and conflict here in the US are deep rooted. We have seen, as many have said, this increase in toxic polarization, surges in hate crimes, membership in extremist groups, systemic racial injustice, diminishing trust in our government institutions, the growing economic inequality, which, if you go back to 2012, we had just gone through an incredible recession, which has now been greatly exacerbated by the global pandemic, but was already on the rise. We have this narrative now of decline, that white people, white Christians, fear their status loss, their lack of influence and power. And this narrative focused on decline could very well further fuel right-wing, right racial extremism, of which some Christian groups are being linked with. And many people tracking far right here within the US are deeply concerned by these trends that we're seeing. But it's also important to understand that there are real grievances out in places in the US and Kentucky and Ohio. And we've seen drugs, legal drugs, oxycodone, wipe out areas of Appalachia. There is significant amount of economic decline. And even if some of these grievances that are out there are perceived grievances are just as important as real grievances. But it is really important that we understand that this is a conflict dynamic that we are in. So even if we just focus on social justice issues, we will still have significant conflict in the United States because there are significant grievances in rural communities. So I think that that is really important. And when we're fighting against this, well, if we want to address grievances in rural communities or in areas in the US that have been steeped in decline, then are we taking away social justice issues? And the point is, we have to work on all of them. And that's what we would do in other countries. And that's where I think the faith community can be very important. But before I talk about that, I also wanted to talk about, we tend to talk a lot about the right and what's the right doing, without talking about the left. At the Alliance for Peacebuilding, we have talked a lot about what has the left got to do with toxic polarization. And I'll say a lot. There's a righteousness, there's a indignant, there's a demeaning, there's also a dehumanizing on the left. Erica Edelson talked at the Alliance for Peacebuilding, and she put up memes that the left puts out. I know, I've laughed at them, I've seen them. We would never condone this in other countries that we are working in. So I think, John, you talked about the fact how we have to listen. I can't even tell you how humbled I am by having to work on conflict in my own country. I cringe sometimes at the things that I have said and done overseas. For example, in Bosnia, I worked in Bosnia for 3 years, writing laws on the Dayton Peace Accords. We told Bosnians numerous times, the key to the Dayton Peace Accords is return. You have to return to where you lived pre-war. We were telling people in Srebrenica that they had to go back and live next to people who might have been involved in killing their families, murdering their families. But yet we cringe and we complain that, ew, we have to go talk to somebody in Ohio, for example. So I say to peace builders, if you can't do it in your home, in your communities, don't go other places and tell people that they have to reconcile. And that is, I think, a big lesson that the peace building community has to happen or has to address. But I want to get back to the US really quickly and some of those worrying trends that we're seeing, the surge in far-right political terrorism, and the fact that far-right attacks have increased dramatically since 2014 in the US. And also that there are signs that political violence is becoming more publicly acceptable in the US by studies that are coming out. We also know that looking at the University of Chicago studies, and I'm not 100% sure it will hold up once it's all said and done and all the data, but when they looked at who was arrested on January 6th in the Capitol, a lot of the people, the majority of people, come from communities not out in Western Kentucky, but from exurbs, not far from cities, where President Biden won the majority, but they've seen the biggest change in demographics. So that's something to understand when we are looking at what is driving conflict in the US. We have to look at it as a complex system and understand that you can't just look at one side. But while other democracies are seeing serious cracks in their institutions, we know the US is polarizing faster than any other democracy. And this should terrify people. And why, we also, under the Fund for Peace, the Fragile State Index last year, the US had their social cohesion score was the worst of any country. And, you can say, okay, social cohesion, what does that, well, we saw that with COVID. Before the vaccine, we got lucky. Pre-vaccine, more than 500,000 Americans were dead because we could not agree on what we had to do as communities and a country to pull together. And that's what the breakdown of social cohesion can do to a country. We've also been characterized as a flawed democracy by the Economics Intelligence Unit. I mean, we could go on and on and on. But what we do know is that violent extremism occurs in economically developed countries where you're seeing social disenfranchisement and exclusion play out. And that's what we're seeing here in the US. And it's what you also saw in Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland, just like the US, the conflict drivers, the grievances are deeply rooted. You had gerrymandering in Northern Ireland. You have gerrymandering in the United States. You have discrimination in Northern Ireland. You have discrimination in the United States. You can go on and on and on and look at some of these similarities, and also what scaled it. An escalation of security operations in Northern Ireland. Well, we started seeing that happening here too, just in 2020. And how quickly that can undermine the situation. We know that there are issues in policing in Northern Ireland. There's issues in policing here in the United States. But the onset of the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement saw a focus on the establishment of power sharing, police reform, but it also took the will of communities to stop the fighting, and want and desire their political leaders to enact change after decades of fighting. And unfortunately, we're not there yet in the United States. I also would like to point out the impact that women had on the peace process in Northern Ireland as well. But some historical perspective just really quickly on religion in the US. And everyone here has said it. We've seen religion can be, it can be a part of the solution and it can be part of the problem. And whether or not conflict is perceived as religious, the role of religion is always somehow present. In the US, we know that religion played a really important part of the ending of slavery, the civil rights movement, Black Lives Matter, the Poor People's Campaign. But we also know that faith organizations, faith leaders, and people in the US can be also significant drivers of conflict. And the transition of Christianity being linked into republicanism. And many noted the overt symbols of Christian nationalism on display in the January 6th Capitol insurrection. And these events brought into sharp focus the role of Christian nationalism on divisions of polarization in the US. But what's happening here in the US when you have church leaders, as I've been told by church leaders, when they tell their parishioners to beware of fundamentalism in all forms, ideology, theology, doctrine, politics, when they confront and work to remove violent behavior, when they take caution when using selective biblical passages, and they speak out against reckless predictions of civil war and conflict, they tell us that they lose their parishioners a lot of times. And so, there is a lot that's feeding into being more, not being moderate because of fear of losing the flock. So we are incredibly at the Alliance for Peacebuilding concerned about the growing violence in the US, but we don't have to accept violent conflict as inevitable. And now is the time that we have to address the US's instability to create a truly equitable, just, fair, and peaceful society for all Americans. And there's a lot of our members, and there's already been a lot of work happening in the United States. The US government has just put out a new violent extremism strategy that looks at upstream prevention, that is focusing on prevention. That's huge. Some of our members, like Parallel Networks and Search for Common Ground, are using the work that they've done on violent extremism all over the world here in the United States, because our violent extremism is no more exceptional than other violent extremism that's happened globally. Mari Fitzduff, a professor at former professor at Brandeis, and did a lot of work in Northern Ireland. We now understand our brains on conflict and the need to make sure that we pull in mental health, because when violent extremists in the United States tell us, and the RAND studies tell us, we're looking at social exclusion, depression. There are many things that are driving people towards these far right groups where they become part of a system, where they become an inclusive system. Organizations like Peace Catalyst and pastors in Texas, like Pastor Bob Roberts, are pulling religious groups together to be a countering weight to pushing, to using religion as a catalyst for violence. Police reform is key. Organizations like Police to Peace are working with communities and police organizations to say, police reform, And we can do that at the community level because that's where those laws get made. Education programs with organizations like New Gen Peacebuilders are looking at how do we not only teach peace in our schools, but actually do it and in communities. NAFCOM and the Trust Network are working at the community level to build social cohesion. We're working with rural communities to say, what is the future of rural? But more importantly, one of the things I want to leave people with is understanding that we can't just decide that we have a good idea and that we're going to do this. Someone's going to do this work. It has to be based on evidence. It's got to be based on what we know works. And when we make a mistake, we change it. Because that's actually one of the things we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of people in the US deciding that they have a good idea and they want to go out and just do a dialogue program, for example. And it's actually causing more conflict. I've attended sessions where I've walked out more polarized than before. And that's really one of the things that I want people to understand is when they are doing this work in the United States, as they would do this work overseas, to know, to analyze what they're doing, to understand what the problem is, and not just come up with an idea that you think would work for you. That is based in evidence and based in that community. But while we need community level programming, we also need programming at the national level. Funding, resources to do this work, and an understanding from our government that democracy programs have to happen here in the United States, just like we've gone all over the world and created democracy programs globally. We need those same democracy programs here as well. They just have to be rooted in evidence and adaptive. And with that, I'll stop and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Liz, for putting this in a global perspective and reminding us that the kind of peace building work that many have done around the world applies just as much to the United States right now. We've got a number of questions, and I'm going to try to bring them together because we have about 20 minutes left. And why don't I start with, all of you mentioned the need to listen and learn, to dialogue, to both bond, but also to bridge. What's and this ties in with your final remarks, Liz, what's the theory of change in terms of dialogue? Are we trying to strengthen the middle, the people who maybe are already inclined to be open to cross-community dialogue of one kind or another, and therefore marginalize the people on the extremes? Or should the attention also be to dialogue with the extremes, which was done, and both were done in Northern Ireland, for example, as Maria and John mentioned. And what's the relation between dialogue and structural social justice initiatives, to deal with some of the underlying grievances that may be contributing to the polarization? That's a broad question, but let me throw it out there.
Well, I can simply quickly say, before we go into more dialogue programs, it's not about just being more civil. We really need to do intra-group work on both sides, and this means the left and the right. I'm not 100% sure people are ready yet to have these dialogue programs bridging until that really hard work has been done. You can, as long as you're not talking about the issues right away. And that you move in this article that I had written, Hands Across the Hills, for example, and they came together to talk about issues that had really nothing to do with politics. And they started looking at solutions and working together in their communities. So I think that that's one really important piece of it, but I'll let others answer.
I'll weigh in and talk about what we do. We begin with the framework of Catholic social teaching. So it's not dialogue for dialogue's sake. We actually think it provides a way to reach people who have different political, ideological perspectives. I frankly find more interest in Catholic social teaching outside the Catholic community than inside in a lot of ways because of the ideas and their value right now. In a real sense, I agree with Liz. Part of what has to happen is we need to build some common ground in our own community before we engage with others. Part of what's going on is political forces, ideological forces see the religious community as a sort of source of troops and votes and money. And so they tailor their audience to reach into the religious community. So you find in my own community that very often our politics shapes our faith instead of the other way around. The best predictor, Pope Francis is enormously popular across the spectrum, but the people who are least positive on Pope Francis are white Catholic Republicans. And I don't think it's because of their faith that they're worried about Pope Francis. It might be that he challenges some of their assumptions. So I think for the churches, we ought to begin with our faith, not our politics. We ought to try and have certain basics. I think Catholic social teaching and scripture provides that. And then within that, we ought to permit a range of options. I really share what Liz said. On the left, there is little tolerance currently for dissent. And there is very little understanding that a lot of people have been left behind. And so while you set some framework and you set some rules, one of the things we do, and we don't let anybody give a speech. Everybody has to respond to questions. We answer. They know what the questions are in a lot of ways, but they can't come in with what I did, my 6 points, and they have to respond to what people say and how we interact with each other. In some ways, we're trying to build up the unity in our community so we can engage with others and build up the common ground across society.
Are you, John? Do you have any thoughts on?
I was going to add, when it comes to building relationships, I don't think we should underestimate the importance of dealing with the symptoms of conflict. So the kind of socioeconomic deprivation or the what happens to a local area and its importance for building relationships. So for example, in Northern Ireland, a lot of relationships have been built through food banks. So people are coming together to work on a common issue, which is food poverty. And while they're packing up those bags of food, they're starting those conversations that they might not be able to have in a structured dialogue, or they might not even be willing to have in a structured dialogue. And they feel as though they're giving something back to the community whilst themselves being formed and shaped. So I think that it's, while the Desmond Tutu quote is very important, we must go upstream and look at why bodies are falling to the river. But sometimes when we're dealing with those bodies, we're making changes in ourselves, and we're taking those changes out into society and the people we deal with. So I don't think it's an either or, and there's a real place for social action in all of this.
I did a lot of work for the government with a couple of other colleagues on the North Belfast Community Action Project, where North Belfast is a part of Northern Ireland, which has suffered more violence than most places and also suffers from acute social deprivation. What we found is that people don't in fact live in North Belfast. They live in parts of North Belfast. little subsections of North Belfast. It's a kind of patchwork quilt of small communities, which are delineated by curbstones being coloured, by murals, by peace walls. And people are afraid of what happens outside their own particular boundary. And a lot of it is fueled with anxiety, as well as the social deprivation element. Sometimes people have done what single identity work, first of all, to give some people a sense of their own significance, in order that they have a certain amount of confidence to engage across the divisions and to engage constructively and not just with hostility across the divisions. I think inside the two communities in Northern Ireland, the Catholic Nationalist Republican as against the Protestant Unionist Loyalist community, there's a greater sense of coherence in the Catholic side of that than there is in the Protestant side. The amount of community resilience and community capacity is much greater in the Catholic side than it is in the Protestant side. The Protestant side, it's a bit like the Presbyterian Church, is split all over the place. You know, Protestantism is divided, subdivided, whereas there's a much greater sense of coherence, cultural coherence inside the Gaelic Athletic Association and the Catholic Church. So sometimes you do that single identity stuff to listen to people in order that they have got the capacity to engage in dialogue. And it's also the case sometimes that some of the most unusual people have in fact got into touch with one another and talked to one another. Sometimes that's the former prisoners from both sides of the community who have themselves been in prison or done terrible things. They refer to themselves as ex-combatants, and they engage with sometimes more dialogue than the mental health people do, than the professional people do. So I am of the opinion that sectarianism is a virus. Sectarianism, a bit like racism, I imagine, but I don't want to talk about racism in America because I don't really understand it. But if you think of sectarianism as a violence, as a virus, it affects everybody to a greater or lesser degree. Therefore, we ought not to start off by saying, oh, they are all sectarian and we are all right. The question is, how sectarian are you? And therefore you start to examine yourself and constantly repent of that element of unhelpful sectarianism, which is not only infects individuals, but infects institutions. Now, Jesus said on one occasion, beware of the leaven of the scribes and of the Pharisees. It doesn't take very much leaven, as Jesus said, to affect the whole lump. And bad leaven can affect the whole lump. And a little bit of bad sectarianism can affect a very large number of people. So I believe that what we have to do inside our disparate communities is to infect the disease inside our own communities and analyze that inside our own communities, rather than simply judging that as we see it in other communities. And that I think is part of the church's job. There is one question in there somewhere on those question and answers as to whether or not theological education is in fact educating ministers and priests for this job of peacebuilding. My own opinion, without being a person who's at all involved in responsibility for theological education in our denomination, my impression is that there is precious little of that going on, that we educate people inside the traditions of the Reformed tradition. I buy 50, 60 copies of Francis's book on the joy of the gospel. I say, you've got to read this. This is good news. Presbyterians need to read this book because it's good news. There's all kinds of instructions inside of here and insights that we need to pay attention to. The trouble is sometimes because it's written by a pope, people won't even look at it, which is a pity. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, I think, in a dialogue with theology engaged and with the context in which the church lives its life. And that context is complex. And we got to understand the complexity of it.
Well, do others have any thoughts on that question of how well our religious institutions are educating both the clergy and also lay people about peace building, about polarization, about ecumenism? Any other thoughts on that? Yes, Maria.
I I don't think the laity are being, within Catholicism, so I speak as a Catholic, I don't think the laity are being well enough educated about Catholic social teaching. It's only in kind of recent years with the kind of Francis effect and his charisma that people have actually started to take any notice of Catholic social teaching in the pews. And certainly within my own parish and within local parishes in North London, it's not something I hear preached about. So I understand that when people talk about theological education, they're talking about priests and ministers. But I also think that when we sit down to think about this, we need to think about how we're going to reach the laity and animate them and make them interested in these things, and provide them with the kind of moral, what was the phrase that John Carr used, that the moral, the language, the moral language that they need to be able to engage in these dialogues.
Can I ask you, who is supposed to deliver that inside the denomination? I presume that a priest preaches for 5 minutes, gives a homily on a Sunday morning for 5 or 10 minutes at Mass. Is that the main means of educating the Catholic community and Catholic social teaching? Or how is it delivered inside the institution?
Richard, maybe you might, this is something that we're thinking about at Las Casas at the moment, but Richard would be, if you don't mind, might be quite well placed to answer this one, if that's okay.
My first thought is that if only priests did limit themselves to 5 minutes in their Sunday sermon, I think then the listening of the Catholic population might improve. But I think it is the primary vehicle. But of course, one should also count on the huge amount of CST that's now communicated through schools, particularly through secondary schools, and the work that in the UK, CAFOD would be doing, and other agencies in other parts of the world.
Let me add a word here. I have a lot of sympathy for those that are trying to keep things together these days. I talked a little bit about the way in which COVID and the financial costs of the sex abuse crisis has decimated the infrastructure of our community. We haven't been together for Eucharist in more than a year, and we're slowly getting back to this. So a lot of people's energy is trying to rebuild a sense of community and belonging, even in a local parish. As somebody who spent my life trying to share Catholic social teaching, I'm firmly of the view it needs to be integrated into how we worship, how our pastors preach, what our schools teach, the witness of our ministries. There will always be specialists and people who work on lifting this up in education and application, but we have to find a way to communicate the essential message of Catholic social teaching in the ways that happen on Sunday morning and Saturday afternoon. And so this is a very trying time for people. And I think we ought to see this as a way to help pastors and teachers do their job better, instead of a new responsibility or a burden we place on them.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. So I want to thank our speakers, John Carr, John Dunlop, Maria Power, and Liz Hume. And I also want to thank a couple people who helped put this together. Ron Pagnuccio from the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. Unfortunately wasn't able to be with us, but this was partly his brainchild. My colleague Cesar Montevecchio at the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, and of course Richard Finn and Maria Power for hosting the event and approaching us with this idea in the first place. And thanks to all of you participants who have stayed with us for an hour and a half. It's been a very stimulating and enriching conversation, and we hope it will stimulate further conversations on this topic both here in the United